here on the brink, just 5 days out from what could be, what will be, the most consequential election since 1864. The stakes, only the future of democracy itself. Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris are in a dead heat. And every move, every message is pulling voters closer to a decision that will define America's future. Over 61 million Americans have already cast their ballots in this year's presidential election so far. Tonight, I'm joined by one of the most insightful voices on equity and democracy, Mr. Colin, who is a powerhouse behind the advocacy group More Equitable Democracy and the hit podcast, The Future of Our Former Democracy. We're going to dive into what this election really means for our democratic system, what's at risk if we get it wrong, and the potential implications for the next generation. We'll be dissecting the challenges, the opportunities, and the very real fight for democracy that's on life support. Mr. Colin, thank you for being part of the Political Mic tonight.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Mike.
So let's start off the conversation by just talking about what's the purpose of the More Equitable Democracy organization, and how does that mission coincide with where we are in this nation's history? You know, for many elections now, every time Donald Trump is on the ballot, it seems we keep hearing democracy itself is at stake.
Right.
The future of democracy is at stake. Well, this year, Donald Trump has been repeatedly quoted by his opponents on the left for saying that he would be a dictator on day one, for admitting that. And many question what's going to happen on day two. What do you have to say about that?
Right. So More Equitable Democracy is a racial justice organization, and we focus our work on electoral systems reform. Our theory of change is that fundamentally, in order to really drive home and achieve policies that will meaningfully improve outcomes and policies for communities of color, that it's not just a matter of, getting out there and voting harder or electing better people, that there are systemic barriers to our elections themselves that prevent communities of color from having adequate representation in government. And so we work with community of color, with organizations primarily led by communities of color that work within communities of color, usually at the local level, to advance electoral systems reform in their communities, to help transform their electoral systems, the ways that we vote and count ballots, so that our city councils and county commissions and eventually state and national governments can more accurately reflect the breadth of views of their constituents, and not just the loudest voice, but all voices.
So Axios today reported that what we've been hearing all along in this campaign so far, that it's a neck and neck race. And it's been that way even when Biden was the presidential candidate, to be honest. It's always been within the margin of error.
Right.
Trump is being told, of course, Donald Trump is getting more scrutiny for his remarks, saying that he's going to be women's protector, whether women like it or not. Democrats have already been cutting out ads, quoting him with his own voice, saying that. There are many on the right that say, this, I don't care how much ads and how much arguments in favor of democracy Democrats are making. I've made my choice. We need a strong man if we're going to succeed on the world stage, if we're going to be competitive against countries like China, if we're going to be able to withstand potential, aggressive moves from North Korea. What is your response to those Americans? It seems like half the country, when we're looking at these polls, if we're going to look at these polls just from a surface level, it seems like half the country has either made the decision that Donald Trump is not a threat to democracy, or democracy is not really in the balance, or if it is, it's not a priority for them. There's so much talk and pivoting to, what about the price of eggs? What about the price of gasoline, the price of groceries? What is your response to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of and I guess this gets at a bit at your earlier question as well about is democracy on the ballot? I think one thing that we tend to focus on in our work is this notion that elections and their consequences, it's really tempting to try to zoom in on one election. Like each election is its own isolated incident. It's its own election about its own issues, about the price of eggs, about the price of gas. But what we tend to find is true is that really systems of power and government policies, they're not about one election. They're about every election. They're about the election this year, but also the elections the years before and the years before that. And it's largely about patterns, and it's about tendencies and trends and what we see happening in elections. And I think that is one reason why there's a lot of reason that folks, I think, can saliently say that, democracy is on the ballot this year, because as we saw in 2016 and in 2020, and as we're seeing now, there is a trend, there's a tendency by large swaths of the American public to question the results of our elections, to not believe in the legitimacy of democracy, or as you're talking about now, to sort of openly accept some of these anti-democratic threats. I've also seen some polls that show that a larger number of young people than ever before are actually questioning whether or not democracy even is a good form of government, and should we try something else. And I think a lot of that comes down to a couple things. Some of it is indeed messaging, I think, just from the far right and from folks in the the MAGA Donald Trump wing of the political party, of the political system. But I think also there's a lot of disaffected people in general across the aisle. Ibram X. Kendi a few years ago started writing about what he called the other swing voter. He talks about in a lot of his writing about how there's a lot of focus in American media and politics on, sort of the mythical swing voter, the folks who went for Obama in 2012, but for Donald Trump in 2016, and how this group of voters, who are predominantly white, working class, Midwest swing state people, they're sort of the focus of both sides of the political aisle. That they're the prize. They're the voters that everyone's trying to win over. And actually, that group of swing voters are a really teeny tiny subset of the population. It's not so much that they're the median or the middle, but they're really weird outliers, actually. And the other thing that Dr. Kendi pointed out, which has stuck with me ever since I read it 4 or 5 years ago, is that there's more than twice as many people who swung from Obama in 2012 to not voting at all in 2016. And these are people who are predominantly younger, predominantly people of color, predominantly working class, who just feel like they don't have a voice, that their vote doesn't actually matter. Whether or not that's because so much of our media messaging focuses on the swing states, and if you don't live in a swing state, it might feel like your vote doesn't matter. But even I think sometimes at the state and local level, it can feel for a lot of us like our votes don't matter. So, I mean, we've all heard that, there's millions of Republicans in California who feel like they don't have representation. And there's millions of Democrats in Texas who feel the same. I live in Washington State, just outside of Seattle. And if you're a Republican in the city of Seattle, you know ahead of time that your vote probably isn't going to get you represented by a governor, by a member of Congress, by someone in the state legislature, by someone in the city council. And if you live in rural Washington, if you live east of the mountains or out on the Olympic Peninsula or in the Southwest, and you're a Democrat, it's probably the same thing. You know in advance that someone that doesn't represent you is going to be elected to represent you. And I think some of these consequences of our electoral system, I think that's what's causing so many people to just kind of check out, to either think that voting doesn't matter, to think that that candidates are all the same. And I think this does tend to end up supporting more of the messaging that we hear from the right about how, well, democracy isn't at stake anyway. Like, oh, it's not like we were in a democracy beforehand. Like, what's the point? And I think that's one of our big challenges at this time, is to push back against that pessimism and to build a democracy where people can meaningfully feel like their vote does matter.
Axios reported today that there was a new internal memo by Tony Fabrizio, who was a chief pollster for all 3 of Donald Trump's presidential campaigns. And he told the former president, according to the Axios report, that he's in a radically better position than he was right before the 2020 election. And the memo reflects the exuberance that Trump staffers and allies exude in interviews and behind-the-scenes conversations. The optimistic framing could potentially make it even more difficult for Trump followers to accept a loss as legitimate. And I want to ask you, Colin, given these razor-thin margins that we've been seeing, with the exception of 2004, it seems as if since the year 2000, we've always had very close. I'm sorry, with the exception of 2008,
Right.
with the exception of 2008, it seems like we've always had these very, very close elections. What does this mean for how both sides mobilize their bases. Are we seeing an unprecedented level of confidence and potential risk from the Trump camp? There is, I even had, a pollster for the Independent Center, Brett Lloyd, make the argument, and I've heard other conservatives say it. No matter who wins, I want them to win by a large margin. No matter who wins, I want them to. And my perspective, my opinion is that if Trump lied this much by now, a large margin is not going to change his tendency to lie about the potential outcome. Even if, say, Harris beats him by, and it's very sound, and there's a huge gap in terms of electoral votes or in population votes, that's not going to stop him from going and to Mar-a-Lago and looking at the cameras and saying that the election was stolen again.
Yeah, well, I think what this brings to mind, I guess, is this notion of political polarization. And I want to put a big asterisk next to this. I think sometimes when folks talk about polarization, they end up sort of equivocating and saying, the answer lies in the middle. We're getting too far apart and we need to find more ways to compromise. And I don't necessarily agree with that on its face. I think that is not nuanced enough. But with that little asterisk applied, we do see that there has been, since the early 90s, an increasing divide between the two sides of the political spectrum. And I think this is driving a lot of that. It sort of started in 1994 with the Gingrich Revolution, when the Republicans took the House under President Bill Clinton. And then it got a lot worse in 2010 with Senator McConnell, saying that their number one goal was not to govern, was not to pass policy. It was to make President Obama a one-term president. And this isn't just rhetoric. You can see, if you go back and you look at the record of how people vote on the floor of the House and Senate. Prior to 1994, there was a lot of voting across party lines, Republicans who would support Democratic initiatives and Democrats who would support Republican bills. And what we've seen over time is that amount of crossover voting is getting worse and worse and less and less and less. And that increasingly, Democrats are now only voting upon party line for Democratic proposed bills and resolutions, and that the opposite is also true. So we're seeing less willingness to compromise, but we're also seeing that both parties are moving away further from each other. Although it's also worth noting, again, not wanting to make a false equivalence, the right wing of the party of the American public is moving much further to the right than the left wing of the party has sort of stuck kind of around the center left. You have had this, this Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren left wing of the party that has grown in prominence some, but the predominant number of elected Democrats are still center left in this country. And because of that polarization and that unwillingness to work with the other side, that extreme, and it's not just not willing to work with the other side, a lot of it is extreme disdain. And we're hearing a lot of this messaging from the Donald Trump campaign about how their political opponents aren't just political opponents. It's not just people who disagree about tax policy. It's not just folks who have a different vision for what the immigration policy should look like. They are painting their opposition as enemies, as morally unclean, as vermin, as folks who are anti-American. And that kind of ramping up of that rhetoric, that is part of what's pushing that divide between the two parties to the point where they're not as willing to work together. And I think that's what's leading to some. I think it's fair to say that sort of divide is why it is really helpful from a democratic legitimacy standpoint to have a clear winner. Because if there's a clear winner, it makes it harder for the opposition, who hates one side, who thinks that the other side are literally their enemies, to be able to say that the election was stolen. But I think, to your point, I think even if it's a landslide, even if Kamala were to win by the amount that Ronald Reagan won by back in his first election, you would still have folks saying, "Oh, it was stolen, it was rigged, it doesn't really count. Those people don't speak for me. It's not my America." And I think they'd reject the election either way. I think a lot of them would, maybe not everyone, but.
And I'm glad you said that. We're such a world apart away from landslide victories, the likes of which we saw in 1984 with Reagan and Mondale, 1972 with Nixon versus McGovern, 1964 with Lyndon Johnson versus Goldwater. or even one of FDR's blowout victories, whether it was 32 or 36 against Landon. There's so many people that criticize the Democratic Party and say, well, when you go out there and say that the Republican Party under Trump is a threat to democracy, that's rhetoric that inspires politically motivated violence, like we saw in July against President Donald Trump, and then we saw a couple of months after that with the second attempt on President Trump's life at his estate in Mar-a-Lago. What do you say to those that say, well, the Democrats are just as guilty for this heightened in extremely partisan environment that we're in, because they always portray Donald Trump as a threat to democracy? They, have repeatedly criticized his approach to national security by saying that it's against America's interests. There are those who believe that, Donald Trump literally believe, based on tangible evidence, that many of his campaign, like Paul Manafort and George Papadopoulos, were in cahoots with the Russian government to help manipulate American voters to vote for him in 2016. Are those criticisms legitimate? And if so, what should the Democratic Party do to alert people to the threat that exists as long as someone like Trump and what he represents has a viable shot at obtaining the nuclear codes?
Yeah, I think there certainly are similarities, but I think it is a bridge much too far to suggest that there's equivalencies. Because there is heightened rhetoric on both sides. I think, but there are differences not just by like degrees of scale, but by degrees of orders of magnitude. On the left, most of the rhetoric that is heightened is critical either of Donald Trump directly as an individual person, or it's critical of his policies. I think it's very rare to see folks on the left in political power. Now, if we're talking about the base, if we're talking about people on Twitter or Reddit, let's put that aside. I think it's very rare to hear like a United States senator or member of Congress say, anyone who votes for Donald Trump in Washington state is an enemy of the people. And if I'm elected, I will round them up into camps and deport them. Like that demonization of individual American people, of voters, of people who have political beliefs, that is kind of exclusive to the right in terms of, again, their elected officials. You do have folks on the left criticizing Donald Trump and his policies. And again, there are definitely leftist activists who will criticize in extremely harsh terms folks who vote on the right. But in terms of literally echoing like far right Nazi fascist rhetoric, both sides are not doing that. In terms of people using messaging that are literally putting targets on people's faces and saying like this person is an enemy, like only one side is doing that. So even though the rhetoric is getting hotter, let's say on both sides, only one side is making it personal, and only one side, I think, is escalating it to like an issue of personal safety and violence. It's one thing to say, my opponent has said terrible thing, that's bad. It's a different to say, my opponent and their voters, are individually horrible people who want to do bad things to your friends and family, and they should go away. And that is just not happening on the other side.
One of my favorite books is The Tyranny of the Minority by Professor Steve Levitsky. I've had him on the show. He's, of course, also the author of How Democracies Die. In The Tyranny of the Minority, which is his latest work, Levitsky and Ziblatt, his co-author, they suggest that the GOP's resistance to America's demographic shift has pushed it into an authoritarian stance. Given that populist movements in Latin America have seized on similar fears of social change, do you think that these trends could deepen political polarization across the Americas? When we look at Venezuela, we see that someone like Maduro, it wasn't conceivable that someone like him could take power until he did. And folks made the same arguments that they're making now. Yeah, they need a strong man. They need someone who's going to be assertive on the world stage. And it's in their own vested national security interest that we have someone of that kind of caliber at the helm of government. You look at India, and they've got Modi. You look at Italy. You look at, even the fact that Marie Le Pen came very close in the most recent election against Emmanuel Macron. I mean, that speaks volumes to the kind of appetite those in France have for that kind of government. What do you think?
So I think this is a really interesting line of inquiry, and I think it actually does dovetail nicely into some of my organizational mission at More Equitable Democracy and the work that we do. Because there's two interesting components of democracy that are both important, and the U.S. often kind of is bad at both of them. So one aspect is that it's important to have majority rule. Like that is an important part of democracy, that the majority should have the right of decision. If most people want something, if more than half of people want something, you should be able to achieve it. And so, when we hear things about like tyranny of the minority, or of the that is driving home sort of that anti-democratic idea, the fact that a subset that's less than half the population can make decisions for the rest of us. We see this sometimes with things like the presidency, when maybe most Americans vote against a certain presidential candidate, but that candidate ends up winning anyway. But we also see it sometimes with things like with the Supreme Court, where we might have public polling data or national election results that show that most Americans support a specific issue, whether that's access to abortion, whether that's mandatory background checks for gun sales, whether that's marriage equality, whether it's the legalization of cannabis. And yet, even though most Americans want something, very often these policies get stalled or blocked or reversed by a small number of powerful people. And that's a problem, this tyranny of the minority. But there's also this sort of other problem. And that is when the minority has no voice at all. And there's another book by a Harvard law professor who has since passed away, Lonnie Guinier, called "Tyranny of the Majority," and she dives into that concept, this idea that just as important to sort of the foundations of American democracy is this dual idea of majority rule with minority representation. That the majority should have the right of decision, but that the minority also deserves a seat at the table, and that the majority shouldn't have the ability to just do whatever they want unchecked, that the minority should be able to raise their concerns, have a seat at the table. And this is also an area in which America often doesn't do very well. This is sort of at the heart of the rationale behind the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What we kept having throughout the country, but especially in the South and in the areas where there was the most active and most egregious Jim Crow laws, and areas that were parts of the former Confederacy, where you would have a city or a school district or a county commission that was majority white racist people who would win every single city council seat. And they would say, well, they're the majority, shouldn't they have the power to win? But what the Voting Rights Act was designed to say is that, look, if you're the majority of the city, sure, you should have the power to win a majority of the city council seats, but you shouldn't have the ability to win every city council seat. That, if 60% of a city wants to support racist candidates, maybe they should have the power to win 60% of the city council seats, but that 40% that are active supporters of social justice, of racial justice, of equality, they shouldn't be completely shut out of power. They should have a pathway to victory. And so that's sort of what the Voting Rights Act was designed to address. And I think this ends up we end up continuing to have the struggle both at the national level and even the local level, this sort of tension between, it seems like sometimes the minority has the power to completely shut out the majority in terms of national policy when it comes to issues through the Supreme Court, through the White House, through inaction on the United States Senate. We can find all the time where the will of the majority of the American people is not being acted on by our elected officials. But what we see more at the local level, at the elected official level, in sort of a district by district situation, is that very often the largest group gets all of the representation and the smaller group gets none of it. And this is that situation of Republicans in Seattle, Republicans in California, Democrats in Texas, Democrats in rural Washington. And the complete shutting out of people is leading to, again, this sort of not just this checking out of politics, but this feeling that they meaningfully aren't represented. And I think that is driving at the heart of a lot of this sort of political legitimacy questions of who represents us and do they represent us well, and are they making decisions that represent us? So, speaking as an individual, I tend to vote more on the left side of the political spectrum. This probably won't surprise folks who have listened to any of this interview. And ostensibly, I am represented by, a member of Congress who belongs to the political party that's closer to my beliefs than the one that's further from my beliefs. But he's not, like, I don't think he represents me very well. He represents me better than the other person, but he doesn't represent my values. He doesn't represent the things that I care most about. And so even I, a blue voter in a blue state, in a blue district, I don't feel much connection to my member of Congress. I don't feel like he does a good job of representing me. And I think this is maybe almost universal. I think the vast majority of people in America might say that they prefer the person who represents them to the other choice that they had, because in America, you often only have one choice. You can choose between the party you disagree with or the party that you like. But I think very few people love their congressperson. They just hate the opponent. And I don't think that's healthy for a democracy or a society, that everyone is sort of tolerating their representative instead of being represented by someone that they really care for. And you can see in public polls, like when you look at people's favorability ratings, like there are some exceptions to this. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has like really high favorability ratings. A lot of the folks who elect Maxwell Frost really like him. But most members of Congress are either disliked or tolerated. Very few are loved. And I think that points to sort of a fundamental gap in American democracy.
So, Colin, one of the things that, since we're on the subject of not just democracy, but democracy around the world, one of the things that Professor Stephen Levitsky also points out is a compelling link between fear of losing status, security, or social dominance, societal dominance, and a turn towards authoritarian tactics. In your view, how has the fear of falling or being second to another country driven recent political movements? And do you believe these fears are being exploited deliberately? The fact that, even Donald Trump said America's a garbage can. Of course, that sparked controversy, and Biden, in addressing those comments, had a slip of the tongue and said that his supporters were garbage. Then the White House clarified his remarks, which is something that Donald Trump folks have never done. They never apologized for anything he said. But, I'm asking this in light of the fact that even, the comedian's joke at Madison Square Garden this past Sunday at a Trump rally alluded to Puerto Rico as an island of garbage. This idea that the country is in a failing position if the other side is in charge, and I'm the only answer to a return to greatness, a return to supremacy, hegemony on the global stage.
I think a lot of that. So first of all, it's real. There is this real fear of losing status, and this does drive electoral decisions. And we see it all the time. And we see it in public polls that show that like there is anxiety, particularly among white Americans, about America becoming a majority not white country in the very near future. And that we can see the trend lines, that is where we're going. And that makes a lot of folks uncomfortable. And I think a big part of this is this sort of unfortunate problem that's sort of baked into US political culture. And this is sort of it's its own long story, but this is sort of an export of British political culture, because we are a former British colony and we have inherited and continue to use the electoral systems that they designed for us. But I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we run our elections as we run our elections in our society really as a winner take all, zero sum game, that one side wins and one side loses. And I think this is really at the heart of what drives not just this political polarization and this increasing animosity towards the other side, but it's what drives a lot of this fear of status, that in order for the other side to do better, that means I have to do worse. And we can see that in a lot of even polling on issues. So one thing that's very interesting is you can see this even just in rhetoric and in messaging. And I'll bring up as an example the subject of tax reform. If you ask folks, do you support everyone paying their fair share in taxes? What a lot of folks sort of end up feeling reflexively to that question is, there are people who are doing worse off than me, which means I'm probably being expected to pay more, which means I don't want to do that. So I'm going to oppose this, not because I don't like fairness or equality, but because I feel like I'm not doing very well right now. I can't afford to pay more. And I know I'm doing better than those people. And that means they want me to help them by me paying more. And that's, if you ask folks about the exact same policy of taxes, but instead of saying, should everyone pay their fair share, you say certain people who are very wealthy and powerful aren't paying what they owe, unlike the rest of us, unlike you and me. We're paying we're paying what we owe, they aren't. Do you think everyone should pay what they owe? Suddenly support for that exact same tax reform policy doubles, because people are worried about themselves, having to give up to get something better. And I think you see that across a wealth of issues. When you talk about raising the minimum wage, sort of the default pushback is, but then I'm going to have to pay more for burgers, or even worse than that, I'm not a paramedic. I'm speaking hypothetically. I'm a paramedic, and I make $28 an hour. I work really hard. It's a specialty field. I have had to go to school and get certified, and I see horrible stuff every day, and it's really hard. And you want, some guy who works at McDonald's to make the same amount of money as me? That doesn't seem fair, because I've had to work so hard. When economically, the truth is that people who work at McDonald's and paramedics all should be making more money. The vast majority of the American public, unless you're effectively in the 1%, unless you're a CEO or you're extremely wealthy, the odds are that you, in your exact same fields today, with your same job, with your same level of education, you would be making significantly more money 60 years ago, with all else being equal. So most of us have had our pay stagnate. And so when we talk about, some people earning more money, we feel this anxiety because we also feel like we're not making enough money. And we feel like if they make more money, we're going to make less, or that it's going to be harder on us because we're going to be put on equal footing to them. And we miss that, what the truth is, it's not just that those people should make more money, it's that all of us should make more money. And even with the McDonald's example, there's statistics that show, were you to raise the McDonald's minimum wage, to $15 an hour or whatever, the actual price per burger difference McDonald's would have to pass, if they wanted to pass 100% of that cost onto consumers, burgers would only go up by a quarter or 50 cents. there'd be effectively no impact. Or you can look at nations like Denmark, where McDonald's runs. They have they have the same products on the menu, but they pay their workers double the rates that they get in America. They get double the vacation time. They get healthcare. They get benefits. Like, these corporations can afford to pay these wages, but our country's policies don't incentivize it. And now culturally, we're all in this place where we feel like it's zero sum. And for someone to do better, you have to do worse. And this feeds all of that cultural angst and anxiety. And this is what makes folks think, if immigrants have more success, I'm going to do worse. And if we, stop over policing and over incarcerating Black and brown communities, my community is going to do worse. And we, instead of focusing on the benefits for others, we're always thinking about, but what does it mean? What's the cost for us? What's the negativity? And if we could move beyond this zero sum framework, it starts becoming possible to realize that it doesn't have to be I win, you lose. There are more options. We just have to explore them.
When you look at countries like Hungary, where Viktor Orban used the legal system to centralize power, or Poland, where the judiciary was undermined, do you see parallels here in the United States in light of the recent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, which basically gave the president of the United States, the executive branch, a free pass to do anything as long as it's considered or can be considered to be within his purview, within his official duties as president of the United States under Article 2. If so, what institutions do you believe are at greatest risk?
I think, honestly, the institution that's at the greatest risk, in a way, is the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court really only can function if it is trusted and if people believe in its democratic legitimacy. And we're already starting off in a place that is, talking about tyranny of the minority, fairly problematic, in that a majority of the Supreme Court has been appointed by United States presidents that most American voters did not vote for. And that on its face is not very good. But then when they start passing or making rulings that are in direct opposition to what most Americans believe in and support, you start having this crisis of trust and democratic legitimacy and faith. And then when you have that same body that starts having political scandals and giving themselves special treatment, it's Mayor Eric Adams is currently being investigated for taking paid for trips by others to Turkey. The crimes that he is accused of are the exact same things that Clarence Thomas has done as a Supreme Court justice. But it's not a crime for a Supreme Court justice to do it. And these sort of double standards, this rules for thee and not for me, this is what really drives a lack of faith in institutions. And that's when you start having a political problem, when people feel like there's either if not just their votes don't matter, but even the systems can't be trusted. They're going to give themselves special deals. Obviously, the executive having the potential to do whatever they want with immunity is problematic on its face. But I also think a lot of folks, based off of the pretty partisan rulings and rhetoric of Supreme Court justices and the activism of some of their family members supporting things like the January 6th attempted insurrection, you end up in this scenario where a lot of folks think they're only ruling in favor of the executive because they want it to benefit their executive. And if it was a different executive, they would have had a different ruling. And there's this sense that there isn't ideological consistency, that it's consistency to support their team. And I think this really is going to undermine a public faith and public trust in elections. To an extent, this reminds me a little bit in sort of a roundabout way of one of the main subject we explore in the podcast, The Future of Reform Democracy, about Northern Ireland, where Northern Ireland is very similar to the United States in a lot of ways. Actually, the whole island is. But it's a former British colony. It had an indigenous population that was largely driven from their lands and had their lands taken from them. They had a revolutionary war and they fought for freedom. You end up having a civil rights movement in the 1960s where people are marching in the streets, calling for rights that are being brutalized by police, being sprayed down with fire hoses. And you end up having a majority that exerts extreme political control over a minority. And this minority ends up having worse access to houses, worse access to jobs. They have worse wages. They have worse outcomes in healthcare and education. And they're blocked from participating in the political system. For about 50 years in Northern Ireland, from the 1920s up until the very early 1970s, 1971, you had one party control and the other party was completely shut out. And what this led to was this minority that was completely shut out, effectively deciding, you know what, the political system isn't working. We have tried to vote for people who represent us. It doesn't work. We can't win elections, or when we do, they're a token voice in the legislature and they're unable to pass anything. So if our elections aren't working, what else is there? And they turn away from ballots and they start turning towards bullets. And this sort of tension of two groups that are very polarized. One side feels like it's not getting what they deserve. The other side completely shutting them out, trending towards political violence, is something that we sort of are worried that we might be seeing here in the United States. We're already seeing political violence, and it's ramping up to a significant extent. And sort of the optimistic take is that the U.S. today reflects Northern Ireland in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when there was low-level, consistent but painful violence. But the worst case scenario is that the United States today is Northern Ireland in the 1960s, and that the violence is going to get worse, and that you're going to have communities and people that feel the political system isn't working, that they can't trust it, that what's the point in voting, and that they're going to turn to violence. And, again, we've already seen some of this with the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, with the January 6th insurrection, with the various Proud Boys demonstrations throughout the country. And the notion of that getting worse, of folks responding to what they believe is a stolen election, whether that's on the national level or the local level, and responding to that in increasingly violent ways when they continue to feel that democracy isn't working, things are going to get worse in that scenario. And one of the folks that we talked to in Northern Ireland that said something that has really stuck with us, which is that whether Donald Trump wins or whether Donald Trump loses, you're going to have to share a country with the people who voted for the other person. And if there's no ability to feel trust in the political process, there's a high likelihood people are going to get violent. And so we have to find a way to rebuild that trust. And I think that's trust on both sides of the aisle. It's folks on the right who need to believe that the political process is not stolen elections, and that ballots are counted, and that we don't have voter fraud that doesn't exist. But it's also people on the left who need to feel that the Supreme Court is not going to overturn the will of the people, that the president is not going to continue being elected by a minority of voters, that within their states and their city councils, that their vote matters. Because when you start having this disconnect between the public will and national policy and national law, that too is going to spur discontent. And it doesn't take a lot for discontent to boil over into violence.
You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but democratic backsliding is often characterized it's often the result of leaders exploiting economic anxieties and national identity to scapegoat immigrants. Countries like Italy, for example, saw the League Party under Matteo Salvini promote the narrative that immigrants were threatening real Italians' access to jobs and welfare benefits. How potent do you think such narratives are here in the United States, especially in regions hit hard by economic downturns in the wake of inflation as a result of the global pandemic? What are the broader implications for democratic trust here in the United States?
I think there's huge implications for democratic trust. One of the great challenges, I think, of the information age in our society today is that, everything is so complex. It wasn't that long ago when you could be a relative expert in many, many fields. But today, whether you're talking, like, you can't just be an expert in the environment anymore. Like, you can be an expert in carbon capture. You can be an expert in batteries, or in windmills, or in hydroelectric power. You can be an expert in acidification, or in underground aquifers, and watersheds. Like, you can be an expert in marshes and bogs, or temperate rainforests. Like, it's so hard to have centralized expertise, and as a result, everything is so complex. And one thing that I think tends to be true in really complex areas, whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about tax policy, whether we're talking about the environment, anything, there are there are there's this tendency for there to be solutions that seem obvious, common sense, simple, efficient, and inexpensive. And what we found is that often the things that are so common sense and obvious often don't actually work. Often the things that seem the simplest, like, why has nobody tried this? Doesn't that seem obvious? They actually are things that we have tried, and we've learned that they don't work. And therefore, this is why we need to start looking, at more complex solutions. And one of the problems that we're seeing with some of this democratic backsliding is that, number one, it's really easy. It's hard to communicate about a complex issue and to talk about all the different nuances and how this might seem obvious at first, but actually, if you think about this effect that's way downstream, it changes this and changes that. That's way more difficult to communicate in a 60-second soundbite than, the immigrants are eating the dogs and they're taking your jobs. And these really loud, simple messages can catch on really quickly. And the defense against that is trust in our institutions. It's trust in the expertise of experts. It's trust in rigor, in academics, in folks who are experts in their field. It's trust in the political process. Even this same notion is supposed to be true in Congress, that the whole point of legislative committees is that no member of Congress can be an expert in every issue. So you put 10 members of Congress on the Veterans Affairs Committee, where they can be deeply, deeply experts in this one issue of Veterans Affairs, and then come back and make recommendations to the rest of the body. And the Congress can know, oh, the 10 people who really know their stuff about this, they have thought about all these complex issues we haven't had time to digest. And now we can sort of take their advice into consideration. But when you start having this big wave that we're seeing today, not just in the United States, but globally, as you suggest, you start seeing this wave of anti-politics, of anti-intellectualism, and of just broad popular movements that sort of reject expertise. And when there isn't trust in democratic institutions, those messages are really, really potent, and they have a lot of potential to be really successful. And the best salve to push back against those is to build trust in institutions. But we've just spent 45 minutes talking about how we have failing and crumbling trust in our institutions, and so it makes sense that people are starting to reject our institutions and not trust in them. And so where else are people going to turn? And I think all of this really sort of drives home this notion that it's sort of, I guess I'm going to try to justify my own existence here. This is why we think it's so important to focus on systemic level changes, because it can never, if it's just about winning this policy debate or electing that candidate, that's just a flash in the pan, and you're missing this broader cultural context, and you're going to be fighting an upstream battle for forever. But if we can change that context so people can have greater faith in institutions and feel represented and trust the democratic process, that suddenly makes fighting those smaller fights a whole lot easier.
Political violence has escalated significantly, from the Oklahoma City bombing to January the 6th, which, points to deeper systemic issues rather than isolated events, in my view. In Europe, rising diversity and demographic shifts led to political responses like Sweden's far right, Sweden Democrats tapping into immigration fears, yet without undermining democratic institutions. But here, similar shifts have prompted efforts to restrict voting access
Mhm.
and challenge election outcomes. So, in your view, could unresolved racial tensions in American history be amplifying these volatile responses? And how might proportional representation, as seen in Northern Ireland, serve as a model to diffuse these tensions and stabilize our democracy? What broader lessons do you think we could take away from European nations navigating similar demographic changes in the 21st century?
Yeah. So I think the example I think I would point back to is that context for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This notion that the majority in a city should win the majority of the city council seats, but they shouldn't win all of the city council seats. And this is one area in which Northern Ireland is really instructive. They after 50 years of one party rule and one minority group effectively being subjugated politically, economically, socially by another for 50 years, they turned to political violence. And so it was the predominantly Irish Catholics who supported union with the Republic of Ireland. They wanted the islands to be united, sort of violently resisting the Unionists who supported being in union with Great Britain, with the United Kingdom, who wanted to remain part of the Union. And those folks were largely the descendants of English and Scottish colonial settlers, but not exclusively. It's very easy to paint this with too broad of a brush, and so I want to call out that there's a lot of nuance here that I'm sort of glazing over. But what you saw as a result of this was they turned to violence and the Irish nationalist movement, and nationalist in this context does not mean the same thing that it does in the US. It means that they wanted a nation of Ireland that was independent from Great Britain. The Irish nationalists turned to violence and started planting car bombs, attacking police and the military because they felt like they had no path to representation. And so one of the earliest responses, one of the earliest responses to this was in 1974. There was an attempted peace deal called the Sunningdale Agreement, where basically what they tried to do was they tried to build a coalition of the willing, of the moderates on both sides who could come together and solve this conflict. But what we saw was that failed to change national elections in Northern Ireland, and it failed because, and I think this is true in the United States as well, just like we talked about with those swing voters who are not actually representative of most people, that middle, those moderates who are willing to compromise, they actually didn't really represent most people, because most people were on one of the two sides. And so the consequence that you saw was most people felt that this compromise didn't represent them. And so most people rejected it, returned to violence, or got more violent in some cases. And I think you could argue that this maybe is similar to what we saw in the United States with the Civil War. How do you compromise between those who support the abolition of slavery and those who support slavery? Like, if you were to try to appease both sides with this mythical middle, what ends up happening? Neither side feels represented, and you end up having conflict come to a head. And so that's what ends up happening in Northern Ireland. It fails, and what happens about 24 years later in 1998, so it takes a long time, is they come up with another peace deal. And what this peace deal is designed to do is to say, okay, instead of just having a coalition of the willing, instead of trying to just elect more people from the middle, what if we have a system that elects some people from all communities, including the extremes, because there are a lot of people on the extremes, but not just them. Also people in the middle, and also people, even more in the middle from that. And what you end up seeing in this context is that is what finally puts an end to the political violence in Northern Ireland. And they've enjoyed about 25 years of peace since that time. In terms of, I think, the analog to the United States, I think that a lot of the animosity towards the system that we see, and again, I don't want to make an equivalence because it's not the same animosity, but both sides, I think, do have feelings that the democratic system is not working well. And you can see that, I think, with the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in cities throughout the country. But you also see it in sort of right-wing responses to anything when they're marching in the streets. You have folks who feel like they don't have a seat at the table. What we saw in Northern Ireland and what we've seen in other countries is that when you offer an off-ramp for people to have some representation, even if it's not all the representation, that really does lower this tendency towards violence, because now it finally feels like you can get something done through this other path. Maybe it's not going to happen overnight, but there is a pathway. And and speaking about this, these fears of a zero-sum game, I think a lot of the sort of white fragility about this notion of white people being replaced, about becoming a minority country, a lot of that is because they're still trapped in this zero-sum mindset that, oh, that means I'm going to have nothing. We've been oppressing people of color for so long, they're going to repress me, and I'm not going to have rights. If we still have the system we do now, where the majority can completely shut out the minority. But if we have a system that says the minority gets some representation, the majority doesn't get all the representation, they just get their fair share. What we've seen in other countries is that this tends to lower the temperature and decrease rates of political violence, but also increase the stability and effectiveness of governance. Right now in the United States, when we swing back and forth between Democrat and Republican, the first year of any administration tends to be undoing what the last administration did. And really, like, the whims of 5,000 voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona can completely change the trajectory of the country in opposite directions. And that's because of our zero-sum winner-take-all system. But under a more proportional system that says every side gets, some representation, that 5,000 votes going one way or the other doesn't completely change a 180. It might just change by 4 degrees, by 5 degrees. And the other thing that I think is really exciting about the notion of a more proportional government, and I want to also say that this isn't just an ivory tower academic concept. So we do have cities and towns throughout the US that are experimenting with proportional representation right now. It was used historically in the United States in the 30s, 40s, and 50s to elect some of the first ever Black men, white women, members of the American Labor Party, the first ever immigrants in much of the country to elected office. So, like, we've seen this system work. What's another thing that's powerful about it is how it does also open us up to be able to have more than just two choices, D or R, A or B. Under this system, under a proportional system, if you're a Democrat right now, you maybe don't have the luxury of choosing. Are you a Bernie Sanders Democrat, or are you a Nancy Pelosi Democrat? Are you an AOC Democrat, or are you a Hakeem Jeffries Democrat? You get to vote for the one Democrat that's on your ballot, and that's it. And same thing, if you're a Republican, you don't have the luxury of choosing, am I a Mitt Romney, John McCain, Liz Cheney Republican, or am I a Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Matt Gaetz Republican?
Right.
You just have to choose to vote for the Republican who's on your ballot. But under a proportional system, you can start seeing these different factions get their own representation. And so, like, right now in Washington State, there's 7 Democratic members of Congress, 3 Republican members of Congress. And of those 7 Democrats in Washington, 1 is a progressive and 6 are moderates. But politically, about half of all Democrats in Washington are progressive. And so if you're a progressive voter in Washington, why wouldn't you feel underrepresented? You tend to support it, again, if you're half of Democrats in Washington, tend to support Bernie Sanders AOC type candidates, and they're never represented by them. And the same thing is true on the right. If you tend to support, John McCain style, rest in peace, or Mitt Romney style, Liz Cheney style Republicans, you kind of don't have a choice right now, because the far right has managed to take over much of the Republican Party, even though most Republican voters don't necessarily align completely with the far right. And that's another way, I think, to turn off this zero-sum game and sort of to restore more of this normal politics that other countries have. Because once you can start electing from a spectrum of political options, you as a voter also are able to stop feeling that the other side is your opposite, because there's not just the other side. Now there's 4 or 5 or 6 sides, and you might really hate these two, but this one you kind of like, and those two you can tolerate. And I think this is how we think in real life about issues, but our politics are disconnected from it. And I think that's what's really exciting about proportional representation, is there's this notion that it can help us more politically honestly express ourselves and be represented. And I think that would do a lot for violence and trust in our political process.
And there's obviously a great need for reform in our political system. It's been, what Trump's rise in politics for the past 9 years has done is really just rip back the veil and show us how much we depend upon goodwill, how much we depend upon unwritten rules. Every election night, the pundits, they get together from both Fox to MSNBC, and they say, well, we're going to witness a peaceful transition of power, and that was abrupted. There's a blemish in the record of the United States now in 2020, and there's some hope in legislation. For instance, with the bill that's Biden signed into law, that's aimed at making it harder to overturn a certified presidential election. He passed it into law in December of 2022. The legislation, overhauls the 1887 Electoral Count Act, which was included as part of the massive $1.7 trillion government funding bill that the Senate passed in 2022. The measure clarifies that the vice president's role in overseeing the electoral results and certification is strictly ceremonial. It raises the threshold to make it harder for lawmakers to force votes attempting to overturn a state certified result. And additionally, it includes provisions that would prevent efforts to pass along fake electors to Congress. There have been calls, amplified calls in the wake of January 6th to abolish the Electoral College. Those on the right have thrown that into the scare tactic bag of things that folks should be weary of, right next to the Green New Deal. Many Americans think that the existing system, while flawed, is too deeply ingrained to change, that we're too deeply invested in the way things have been operating for nearly 250 years, that both sides have dug their heels in too deeply into their respective political ideologies, especially given how vested interests benefit from the status quo. How do you think proportional representation could work its way into the conversation about electoral reform here? Are there practical steps to move from theory to reality to make this more of an authentic democracy? I know that there's those that'll say, well, we're a democratic republic. Well, not everyone who lives in the state of Texas agreed with Ted Cruz's decision to try to challenge the electoral votes in 2020. Representative Gosar, not everyone in his district, I would say, agreed with his decision to challenge the votes right before all hell broke loose and the January 6th rioters got inside of the chamber.
Yeah, this is really my jam. This is what I'm really stoked to talk about. I think, and I know this is gonna sound like hokey, and it's like maybe a little cheesy, but like really it is possible to achieve change on our electoral system. I know it's really tempting to say like things will never change. It's too hard to change. And and I firmly believe that it's not. And I feel like I can make a persuasive argument. So, especially if any of your listeners at this point are deeply skeptical, like that's the person I want to talk to right now. And the first thing I want to say is that historically, all of our big social changes have genuinely felt impossible until they weren't. So if we go back just to the year 2007, the two main candidates for the Democratic nominee for president of the United States, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, both said on the campaign trail that they believed marriage was between one man and one woman. And it did not feel like marriage equality was on a path to become the law of the land. Maybe there were supports for civil unions, but like the two heads of the Democratic Party were opposed to it. And a few years later, you had 4 states mandate marriage equality at the ballot. And then a couple of years after that, the Supreme Court decided to mandate that marriage equality was the law of the land. And no one saw that coming. If you go back to 1955, when Jim Crow laws around the United States were sort of in some places at their zenith, before well before JFK's campaign, it would have felt like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were never going to happen. That racialized politics were just too extreme, and then it happened. Same thing with giving the women the right to vote. Same thing with abolition, although that took a violent conflict. But we can talk about that on another day. The point is that there are these like entrenched systemic realities that feel like they can never change. But when the conditions are right, there are brief windows where change really is possible. And I personally think that we might be approaching one of those brief windows. There's a lot that I think I want to really briefly touch on to help excite folks about this. First of all, moving the U.S. Congress to proportional representation would not require a constitutional amendment. It could just be an act of Congress. And that means, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate could vote on it, and then it would become the law of the land. Like, they could just do it. Now, that's not going to happen tomorrow, but I don't think it has to happen tomorrow. So I want to go back to Northern Ireland for a second. So I said that, in 1974, they attempted reform. It didn't work. And then they came back 24 years later in 1998 and had this proposal to move to the system of proportional representation that did work, and it largely resolved their political violence. But there wasn't just 24 years of nothing. What happened was, after the Sunningdale Agreement failed, you had a lot of local governments, city and county governments throughout Northern Ireland, that started experimenting with proportional representation, with this idea that we can give the minority their fair share of representation while having majority rule at the same time. We can have majority rule and minority representation. And over about 20 years, you start having more of these local places use this system. They found that it released tension. It helped more people feel represented. It increased trust in the democratic process. And that is what laid the foundation for that 1998 agreement. And I think you can see the same thing in the US today. Portland, Oregon, back in 2022, became the first major US city since the 1930s to adopt a proportional representation system. They're not the only ones, though. Albany, California adopted proportional representation back in 2020. In 2019, the Detroit suburb of East Point, Michigan, used proportional representation to resolve a federal Voting Rights Act lawsuit that was brought in the waning days of the Obama administration in January of 2017. You have cities and counties and school boards throughout the South, in North Carolina, in Alabama, in Texas, in Missouri, that use semi-proportional systems that have been adopted to resolve Voting Rights Act lawsuits. So we have already had change. It can happen. We can change our electoral systems. I mentioned in the 30s and 40s, when it was used more widely, it elected the first of many things throughout the country, in New York City, in Cincinnati, in Massachusetts, in Sacramento. They used proportional representation. And at the time, it was largely taken away because it was sort of too successful. Democrats and Republicans joined forces because they didn't like that it was electing Black people. They didn't like that it was electing women. They didn't like that it was electing members of the Communist Party because this was the Red Scare post-World War II. And I think if we had that same system today, although there's still certainly racism and anti-communism and sexism today, I would go so far as to say it's not as ubiquitous in the American public as it was in the 1940s and 50s. And I think that same repeal campaign wouldn't be as successful. And there's this notion that, we conduct our elections a certain way. We've always conducted them this way. We can't change it. And that feels true, but it actually isn't true. We have a wild patchwork of systems in the United States. Not only does every state do it differently, but even within states, there's a bunch of different systems. So again, I'll use Washington as an example. Our county commissions nominate candidates by zone, but they're elected at large in a November general election. For Supreme Court, for judicial races, there's a top 2 primary, but if only 2 candidates run, the primary just is the election. Or you can skip the primary altogether and show up on the ballot in November. Some places we have districts, some places we have at large, some places we have district and at large. Some places starting in 2025 are going to use ranked choice voting in their primary. It's a patchwork. Some places use ranked choice voting for president. Some places use other voting systems like cumulative voting and limited voting. Some places have automatic runoffs. Some places have a runoff election if you have less than 50% of the vote in the general election. Some places have special elections in April or in May or in June. Some places have party primaries or closed primaries or open primaries. There is no one way we conduct elections in the US. And so our electoral system, it's not a sacred cow. It's not like this thing that our founding fathers wrote on a holy text and handed down to us from the Mount. And it's this thing that, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson wrote, and now it's how we all conduct our elections. There is no one way to do elections. And that is why I think it's possible to run reform campaigns and really win, because we've already been changing our electoral systems for centuries. Our founding fathers actually said that they wanted us to change our electoral systems. We have places that are changing them now at the local level, and we're seeing them meaningfully change not just who gets elected, but what the campaign environment is like, what it's like when people run for office. There's an amazing election ad from Oakland, California from a few years ago, where 3 women of color are running for one city council seat, and they all endorse each other, and they all talk about why the other person would be an amazing candidate for this position. And they recommend that you rank each of them as your first choice, second choice, and third choice, because they use ranked choice voting. And like, this different type of politics is not just a fantasy. Like, it's real. We saw that in the mayor's race for San Francisco. We saw a few years ago when London Breed was up for her first election. The Democratic primary for the governor's race in Maine had candidates cross-endorsing each other. We saw this in the Minneapolis mayoral election way back in 2013. It doesn't have to be this way, and people are already making changes. So you probably aren't going to change Congress overnight, but like, if you're listening right now and you are excited by this idea, you could start working to change your city council or even your school board to a proportional system. And just like with post-Sunningdale in Northern Ireland in 1974, you could be laying the groundwork today for a better United States Congress in 2048. And that's my soapbox. I'll get off of it, but I really want folks to work on change.
Well, Mr. Colin Cole, thank you so much for joining me tonight on the Political Mic. And to our listeners, More Equitable Democracy is a racial justice organization led by people of color, dedicated to advancing racial equity by transforming our electoral systems. And as a nonprofit intermediary, More Equitable Democracy collaborates with communities of color to promote reforms that increase representation, to increase representation for underrepresented groups. And the podcast that More Equitable Democracy has established is entitled "The Future of Our Former Democracy." And I encourage my listeners to tune into it. And thank you so much Mr. Colin, for what you brought to the table. It was a pleasure and a joy to speak with you tonight. With that being said, that's going to conclude tonight's episode of the Political Mike Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.
Take care.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike Podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.